Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. We just talked about Jaden Rashada suing Billy Napier and a Florida booster, and how that is the wildest story that I've seen in quite some time. But we'll break that down as it comes and give you guys an idea of where those proceedings are holding. But before we jump into the next segment, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question to the top of the queue, get it on the screen, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen there, gsmcpodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to have a fun kind of interactive experience here, and we get to know each other a little bit better, which is always fun. Again, that's gsmcpodcast.net. But let's jump into this next segment and let's talk about the NIL market. We just talked about an absolutely crazy deal that absolutely should have never happened from Florida's perspective with Jaden Rashada. But let's talk about the normal deals in NIL, the ones that actually make sense for the university, actually make sense for the kid, and find themselves somewhere in the middle of this craziness that is NIL. And it's a great piece that John Talty did over there on CBS, kind of breaking down all of the ranges that he has seen in some of these deals and giving you guys an idea of what the going rate is for a power four quarterback, running back, wide receiver. But let's start with the quarterbacks. Obviously, this is going to be the biggest number. There's no two questions about that. Obviously, the 800,000 is not the peak of that number. There are definitely quarterbacks out there, the Quinn Ewers, the Carson Becks of the world, that make more than that. There's no two ways about that. Shadur Sanders, another one that definitely makes more than that. But at the end of the day, let's say it's 800,000 a year for Dylan Gabriel to be your quarterback at Oregon. I gotta say, that's kind of a bargain for a lot of these big time teams, for a lot of, the Oregons of the world, the Georgias of the world. They have that money to throw around. And if you're getting a quarterback that is at that level, it's not a bad thing by any means. Now, I don't really know what Dylan Gabriel's NIL deal looks like with Oregon, but in the hypothetical world where he is that, top echelon of this range, that's pretty good to me. I got to be totally honest. If that's what you're giving up, I think you're getting a little bit of a bargain at that quarterback position. Obviously, running back is a place where they'll save a little bit of money, kind of follows the NFL way of things, where running backs are just not as much valued anymore with the spread offenses. Although I've kind of started to see a little bit of a flip back to running backs being a bigger part, but I think that's something that will develop over the next couple of years. I think it's one of those things where as long as you have the system, as long as you have the offensive line, as long as you have a lot of those things in place, a lot of running backs can do the job. Now, you want to get the right guy. Obviously, you don't want to skimp by any means, but this is definitely a place where you can kind of save a little bit of money, as it were. Wide receiver market is obviously going to be one that is pretty variable. There's going to be a huge gap between, getting the fourth guy in a class to getting the top guy in a class, right? But in the grand scheme of things, I think all of this makes a lot of sense. I think there is definitely top-end guys that are above this, but 300,000 when you have to spread it around as many guys as they do is going to be, a little bit tough at times. It's why, you've employed GMs and NIL directors and all of this type of stuff around the country, because figuring out how all of this money is going to be kicked around, especially in position rooms like wide receiver or like DB, like we'll talk about later, is definitely a big time thing and not necessarily the easiest thing in the world to do. O-line is very clear to me. There's going to be a big range here, but also it should be the second highest. There's no two ways about that. I think everyone that has watched football for quite some time has said left tackle is the second most important position on the field because it covers the most important part for the most important position on the field in quarterback. So I do think this makes sense. You will see a lot of left tackles go over that 600,000 number. There's no two ways about that. But some guards and centers will probably be a little bit lower in this range, or, some elite ones might be a little bit higher. Maybe the Tyler Bookers of the world might be a little bit higher in this range. But overall, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, all of this is going to be very, very important to building out your team. Another position room where you have to spread out the wealth a little bit more, but at the end of the day, you got to spend your money there, because if you don't have a good offensive line, you're not going to win games, bottom line. There's no two ways about that. And then the D-line market is really, really interesting in my mind. Obviously, I knew that they were going to have a pretty wide range, but did not necessarily expect it to be any higher than O linemen. And maybe that's because offensive tackles were not as big a part of that O lineman group as the edge rushers were for the D linemen, because I think that's likely where you get those big time NIL deals where you have that elite edge rusher coming off the edge. Colin Simmons coming out of high school might have been a great example at Texas. Don't know what his looks like by any means, but definitely those type of guys would be garnering a little bit extra of that range there. And I think interior defensive linemen, there are certain guys out there that are just absolute beasts, and you have to have them on your team. Obviously, these numbers, the range is very different when you talk about high school recruiting compared to transfer portal, because we found that transfer portal tends to be a little bit more NIL based than high school recruiting, at least across the board. So it'll be interesting to kind of see, is this, a lot more transfer portal guys pulling this up? Is this, are the recruiting kids for high school, are they below this range? And it's just kind of finding the middle ground between the two. But at the end of the day, it does look like there's, quite a large range for D linemen. There's definitely going to be a little bit of it's going to be tough to kind of figure out how to spend your money there, just because you need different skill sets, you need different body types, you need different guys, and it's a really hard proposition overall, just to kind of figure out where you kind of land on all of this and how you're going to dole out all of this money. But at the end of the day, that's a GM's job, not necessarily mine. But it does kind of back up Brian Kelly's unwillingness to pay the alleged $1.2 million for Dominic Williams, the TCU transfer that found his way to Oklahoma. This gives you an idea of just how crazy that number is. Now, Dominic Williams is a fantastic player and will be a big-time player for Oklahoma this upcoming year, but at the end of the day, it's hard to blame Brian Kelly for not doing that when you see that number. But at the end of the day, linebacker is going to be the area where, kind of like running back on offense, where you're trying to save a little bit of money. You're trying to figure out a way to kind of spread out the money a little bit more. Obviously, wide receiver as well on the offensive side of the ball. Linebacker is one of those things where if you find a really, really special guy, you'll break the bank. But at the end of the day, it's really about guys that fit into your scheme, guys that can do the things that you need them to do, because a lot of linebackers' jobs are scheme-based. Whether you're running a 4-2-5 and you have to have one outside linebacker that can chase guys and do coverage, and then one solid middle linebacker to hold things down, or you're running like a 4-3-3 or 4-3-4, and you're kind of playing around with some different concepts, and you have to have some different bodies there. So linebacker's a little bit harder one to pin down, a little bit harder one to figure out, just because some linebackers really turn into edge rushers, some inside linebackers, are a little bit harder to come by in terms of just being ready to play right away. So this one's a little bit all over the place. This range can definitely vary depending on the player, but special linebackers absolutely will push these margins. There's no two ways about that. And then you have DBs. This is another one, kind of like wide receivers, where you got to spread around the wealth. So it's going to be a little bit harder for those guys to get those big-time deals. Now, big-time corners, it's not going to be a problem. Travis Hunter is going to be absolutely one of the guys that is going to be towards the top of this list. Caleb Downs up at Ohio State, I don't know what the deal was, but there were rumors that Ohio State spent their fair share of NIL money this offseason, so I'm sure he finds himself right up there towards the top. But one of the biggest takeaways I had from this was one of the operators of multiple collectives actually said a football players at $1 million is rare right now. So it kind of gives you an idea that this NIL game might not exactly work the way that a lot of people think it does. And it's not to say that there isn't money being thrown around, and it's definitely not to say that there aren't $1 million guys in college football right now, because there are. But the reality is, you got to be a little bit frugal. You have to make sure that you're not pushing your boundaries too much. We just talked about how Florida did that, and it is causing a ton of problems that could hurt that program not only in 2024, but for the next decade, if I'm being totally honest. So there's a lot of things that go into this, and you have to do a lot of really hard calculus to figure out where you want to spend your money, how you want to spend your money, and which guys you're going to break the bank for, which guys you're going to not break the bank for and maybe give a little bit leaner of money, and how that's going to affect your locker room. So this is all a tightrope walk. There's no two ways about that. But as you can see, a lot of these monies have a lot of zeros, or a lot of these dollar amounts have a lot of zeros next to them, and it's essentially more money better equals better team. I get it's not a pay for play style right now, or at least it's not supposed to be, but this is the reality of the game. If you can't play the NIL game, you're going to have a really hard time winning football games. So this is something that I kind of expect to continue to rise as we see, media rights deals and revenue sharing and all of that stuff continue to rise. But these numbers are pretty wild. I won't lie to you. If you told me, 5 years ago that I was going to be looking at these numbers and seeing $800,000 for a player for a year I would have called you crazy, but here we are. NIL world's a wild world, and we'll definitely keep you updated with all of the changes that happen in it. But that gives you an idea of just what the going rate is right now and how that kind of makes the job of a GM just that much harder. But we'll take our second break here. When we come back, we're going to talk about the biggest storylines going into the season, some big-time things to talk about, conference realignment, new playoff expansion, maybe a little fight for the number one overall pick next time around in the NFL draft. So a lot of big things to talk about, so we'll break that down right after this.